مساء الخير.
Hello. Hello,
مساء
everyone.
النور.
Hi. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first poetry and prose evening of 2021. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Nesreen Akhtarkhavari, and she is an associate professor of Arabic and the director of Arabic studies at DePaul University. She is a writer, scholar, and a translator. She is an author of Arabic short stories, also a translator of 8 literary works from Arabic to English, including 3 poetry and short story collections and 5 novels. In her presentation, she will examine the notion and essence of love as a construct of the soul and pathway to eternal spiritual reunion, a glimpse of the connection between man and the divine. She will exemplify by reading Rumi's Arabic poem titled What Happened, ماذا حدث. I would like to remind everybody to hold your questions until the end, but you can still type them in the chat and I will read them towards the end. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Nisserin.
مساء الخير. Good evening. Thank you guys for coming and happy Valentine for everybody. So today, can you just quickly raise hands and tell me how many of you are very familiar with Rumi? Great, great. All right. So then that way I don't have to go through too much of the introduction, but since I don't see too many hands, so forgive me for those who what I'm going to say will sound redundant. Today we will be talking about love as a connection to the divine. The story of Rumi and love is pretty unique. Rumi is a very famous debated of his origin, but Persian, more mainly claimed by Persian, a Persian poet who wrote both in Persian, in Arabic, and a little bit in Turkish. He is currently buried in Turkey. He's one of the, if not the most read poet in the English language, claimed to be the most read poet in the English language because of the effort of the translators who did such a great job on translating Rumi. The problem with and most of the, if you go and search on the internet for Rumi poems, most of the work that you find is translated by people who did not speak Persian, but translated the poem from translation. And many of the translators took a lot of, they managed to put their own spin of what they understood from the poem that is already translated. So the version of the poem that you see is not exactly 100% of what Rumi said. The same thing with regarding our translation of this poem that I will be sharing with you. We translated it, so there are some poems of Rumi that are written in Arabic, and that's not very well known because most of the poems that are translated and published, I want to say 99% of them are from the Persian language. There were different reasons why the Arabic poems, in my opinion, were not translated. Partially because they are extremely embedded in the Arab culture and the Islamic tradition. So when you read his Arabic poems, he is quoting the Quran, he's quoting the Hadith, he's quoting al-Mutanabbi, he's quoting different things that portray his position, his origin, his place within Arab culture. A lot of the translations, the current translations available in the market of the Rumi poems, placed him as a new age poet, as a progressive poet, as a poet who managed to break away from Islamic tradition. But in reality, Rumi was an Islamic scholar. And now, I'm going to share with you his story with Shams Tabrizi and his introduction to the whole notion of love and the love of the divine and the love of the human being as a way to figuring out the love of the divine. So, I think it's really important to understand that Islam itself is capable of producing these kind of poets. It's not Islam, these poets broke away from Islam, and that's why they are global and humanitarian poets. And we have so many other poets who really kind of created the tradition. Rumi is not the first one to write Sufi poet. You might be interested to know that one of the main scholars, main poets who started the tradition of Sufi poetry is a woman called Rabi Al-Adawiyah. And Rabi Al-Adawiyah was she was a slave girl who found her path to God and decided to write poetry to express her love for God, and became one of the most influential Sufi poets in the Arabic language. That's why it's important to talk about her, because the language that is used, the eroticism that is embedded and full and kind of frame the Sufi poetry comes from her language, because she was a slave girl, and what she did is she provided sexual services, part of being a slave, and a singer and a pretty slave. And she understood the physical love very well, but she took that language from the physical love and she used it to praise the divine. So she kind of almost purified that language and made it a spiritual medium for communicating with the divine, but still kept it a lot of its features that are very erotic. So when you read Arabic is an erotic language. That's another lecture for another day. Arabic is one of the few languages that really it has a science, a whole science that is called Ilm al-Ba, and it's a science of love. And it has manuals. Ibn Hazm, one of the most prominent Andalusian scholar, wrote a whole manual about virgin love called Tawq al-Hamama, the Ring of Love. It's a manual that tells you exactly like what are the symptoms, what happened to you, and he wrote it in prose and poetry. And because they saw it as a science, and there is so much more into that, and their poetry was extremely explicit in their presentation. And Arabs have a very high tolerance to eroticism in poetry in the oral form, but we have no tolerance to visual eroticism, which is very interesting because we are people of an oral language. So back to the story of Rumi. So Rabi Al-Adawiyah, by her introduction and her strong influence in the Sufi poetry, introduced a lot of the language and vocabulary and expressions that are very physical. So when you read it, you're like, wow, how is that spiritual? But she is the one who kind of changed the perceptions of Sufism into saying that you don't love God for reward or punishment. You love God for the sake of God. So it is a pure love. You love him because you love the being. And that's what made her poetry very strong and very impactful. So Rumi was a very renowned Muslim scholar who went and studied everywhere, and his father was a scholar, and he had a mentor who was father, after his passing, kind of assigned to him, and he had perfected the sciences of religion. And then there was this dervish, this Sufi master who came from Tabriz, which is part of Iran. And he was roaming around the land of God, looking for somebody who is worthy to teach the art of love and the science of love, which, according to Shamsuddin Tabrizi, without this art and science, religion is not complete. How intriguing this concept in our today society too, understanding that religion and whatever we do, if it is not presented and understood and internalized through the context of love, then it is not worth having, or all these sciences are for nothing. So he was looking around and he had this one little puzzle that he wanted people to ask people about their understanding of religion. And the minute he brought it up to Rumi, Rumi immediately responded. And Rumi, when he saw Shams Tabrizi, this overwhelming love that the Shams Tabrizi had and he had mastered, then the connection between them was from the first sight. So Shams Tabrizi goes to Rumi's place and tell him, and they sit there and they close the door on themselves and they talk for days. Now, this created a lot of jealousy from the disciples of Rumi, and they were wondering, is like, who's this guy who just pops in and suddenly he is the favored and the beloved of Rumi. But Rumi, Shams Tabrizi recognized that Rumi has the capacity to understand love in its divine context. So this love that he felt for Shams Tabrizi was a sample, an example of what our love for the divine could be. And it took Shams Tabrizi to separate from Rumi, which created a tragedy for Rumi. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he felt like he's dead, he was truly abandoned by his lover. But then it took that separation for Rumi to realize that it is that love that he have captured in his relationship with Tabrizi is really the core concept of the relationship with the divine. It's not the person of Shams Tabrizi. So when you started reading, when Shams Tabrizi left, he was so desperate, and he started saying, before he wasn't really a poet, but then he suddenly started saying poetry, like, without, just spontaneously. And one of his students asked his permission to write the poetry down. There is this, there is a clash of civilization, truly, between Arabs and Persians all through the ages. And Persians, unfortunately, sometimes think that they are so much more, than Arabs, and they are the bearer of civilization and stuff like that. So a lot of the scholars who truly are immersed and study Rumi, they don't recognize much of the Arabic poetry of Rumi. I think partially because it's very hard to understand, and it's very, Rumi put all of his sciences that he knows. So there is Islamic Sharia in it. There is Hadith in it. There is poetry from the Mutanabbi in it. The language itself is such a high language, and it's so embedded with cultural context, and not familiar cultural context, not common cultural context from our time, so it's really hard to understand. So it's easier to say, hey, dismiss that Arabic poetry of Rumi. But Arabic poetry of Rumi are very, are a reflection of his both state of mind and state of religion. And that's what I think make them very powerful poems. So I'm looking at the time, 15 minutes, all right. So that's, this is, so, and he started writing those poetry, and then his student copied them, and that's why they are extremely developed, very metered, and very full of cultural context and religious symbolism and all kinds of stuff. So now we want to translate those poems. So I read those poems, I understand them in Arabic, but then we want to translate them. And I have a poet friend, his name is Anthony Lee. He's an award-winning African-American poet. he had worked with another translator in the past, working on Persian Rumi poems and translating them to English. He doesn't speak a word of Persian. Well, he speaks a couple of words of Persian, but he speaks no Arabic at all, which is great for me because I don't want anybody messing up with what I say is the meaning. But he is a poet and I am not a poet. So for us to produce English poems that have the spirit, the tone, and the content of the Arabic poems is really a very, almost at times, impossible task. You end up compromising. And the compromise for me was you cannot lose the meaning. You could break. So what we did, so I would translate the poem literally and he will take it. And sometimes I'll share with you in the end one poem, a very short poem that is literally translated. Whatever in English is in Arabic is exactly in English. But in so many instances, he's going to put a spin on it of what he understands, and he's trying to meter it and make it a poem, and I am breaking it. So we end up sometimes like going 15 times back and forth till we both are comfortable. He's comfortable that it looks almost like a poem, and I am comfortable that it is including in it has the meaning that I want to make sure that it's there and it's not lost in the translation. And this also end up in sometimes having me adding some footnotes because this is a poetry book. I don't want to add too much to it. You don't want to make it sound like a research dissertation or something. But one thing we did in the two volumes that we produced, we broke the poems into three little volumes, so people can buy it and see if they like it, and then get the other volume. But then one of the things that we made sure to include is an introduction, talking about Rabi Al-Adawiyah, talking about the language, talking about analyzing some of the poems. So we have an essay that is in the beginning of the book that introduces the work and introduces the author. And then in the next volume, we talked about the development of Sufism and how it was impacted by different things. And then in the final version, we can talk about contemporary Sufism and how where did Rumi impact and affected. So still have some time. So this is this is the story. This is a very brief introduction of the story of Rumi. So when you and then there was this debate: was there really a physical relationship between Rumi and Shamsuddin Tabrizi? And I don't know. I really don't know, and I really don't care because that's not the point. That's not the moral of the story. I think it was that divine. It was whatever it took to teach him that love is this great. And this is why I mentioned in the beginning the Manual of Love. It's the Manual of Virgin Love by Ibn Hazm, because he talks about how these emotions that we feel are part of who we are as human beings, part of the way God created us. And then he talks about the stages of love and, how do you fall in love and what happens when you fall in love. And then Rumi takes us to another dimension and explain to us that if you don't experience love, then you don't know how to love God, because you have to know in the physical term, and then you have to understand. That's how you understand the love of God. Or in a better explanation is that this is the closest thing we are going to get to understanding our relationship with God. So it's and then because also in the Sufi concept of love, it's not like I love you and we have a mutual relationship and stuff like that. It is the annihilation, like the destruction of the self, where death become life. When you allow your soul to your ego, yourself, to stop existing, and you put the affairs of the lover before your affairs, and he or she or the entity becomes the focal of your existence, then you kill the self, and that's where death is in life. And I don't know how many of you know the story of Layla and the Majnoon, which is an Arab story. Again, because Attar wrote it in a long ode, the Persians also like to claim it. And actually Attar took it to a different level and brought the Sufi concept into it, and embed it with the spirituality. But that's the story of Layla and the Majnoon. Is Layla, there is this guy, his name is Qais ibn al-Mulawah, fell in love with Layla. And when he fell in love with Layla, he could see nothing but her. He could not live without her. And he went on around the desert saying poetry about her and describing her and talking about his love for her. Of course, that was not acceptable in Arab culture. It's still not acceptable that much in Arab culture. So he was banished, and she got married to Werd. And Qais went crazy because he couldn't imagine that Layla is with somebody else. So I'll give you a very quick example of what happened. For example, he goes to, after the first night of marriage, he goes to the tent of Werd, and tent of Werd is full of all of those guys coming there to congratulate him. And he sit there next to the charcoal where they're making the coffee, next to the fire, and he pick up some charcoals in his hand, and he doesn't even realize he have a charcoal in his hand. And then he say those 2 lines of poems. He say, بربك هل ضممت إليك ليلى قبيل الصبح أو قبلت فاها وهل رفت عليك قرون ليلى رفوف الأقحوانة في شداها. By God, did you kiss Layla's, did you hug Layla before dawn, and did you kiss her lips, and did her hair wafted over your shoulders, like, so, and because he asked him by God, then Ward couldn't but say, because he is provoking, he's invoking the name of God, then Ward had to say yes. And then Layla, he's in so much pain holding to the charcoals and knowing he's holding the charcoal that he faints. And anyhow, but then when they tell him that Layla died, he goes around and he walks and he finds a little rock that he thinks it's her grave, and he sleeps there and dies. And then she finds out that he's dead and she dies. So they think that that's where Shakespeare got his Romeo and Juliet from, stretched. But hey, so this story of Layla and the Majnoon becomes another representation in Sufi poetry, in Sufi literature, about the divine love, where you have no existence without the lover. And that's the love between man and God. So this is, I can go on and on about this, but I think I'm looking at the time. We better get into the poem. So are we okay with you guys? Anybody have like a very quick question about this before I read the poem, or we're good, we leave the questions till the end?
I have a very quick question. When we're looking to read some poetry from Rumi online, how can we check whether it was originally written in Arabic or whether it's a translation from Persian into Arabic?
It will say in wherever you're getting it from. It should say anything other than work. Our work is from Persian. Like I said, 95% of the work is translations from Persian. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen now and read for you the poem that I selected for you, and then I will, okay. Hey, I do this for classes all the time. What happened? We'll try again. Oh, you know what? All right, let me reduce this and see what's happening in my screen here. take this out, close this, make this large, and now we can share. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Can you guys see it?
No.
No? Okay. All right, well, we'll try one more time. Okay, can you see it now?
Not yet. Oh, yes.
Good.
Yeah. Slideshow.
Yes, I will put it on the slideshow. So here is Rumi. Here is Rumi after he got really beaten up with love. All right, so what I'm gonna do first is I want you to hear the poem in Arabic. I will read it slowly because that's where the magic is. So I'm gonna read it slowly and you have the translation. I think that Dr. Al-Muhsin sent you a copy of the translation and the poem, but I have the translation here. And what I will do is I will read it in Arabic. And then after I read it in Arabic, I will come back and explain it, explain to you what have been lost in the translation. How does that sound? Good, thank you. Okay. The name of the poem is What Happened? ماذا حدث؟ أبصرت روحي مليحا زلزلت زلزالها انعطش روحي فقلت ويح روحي ما لها ذاق من شعشاع خمر العشق روحي جرعة طار في جو الهوى واستقلعت أثقالها صار روحي في هواه غارقا حتى درى لو تلقاه ضرير تائه أحوالها في الهوى من ليس في الكونين بدر مثله إن روحي في الهوى من لا ترى أمثالها لم تمل روحي إلى مال إلى أن أعشقت رامت الأموال كي تنثر له أموالها لم تزل سفن الهوى تجري بها مذ أصبحت في بحار العز والإقبال يوما يا لها عين روحي قد أصابتها فأردتها بها حين عدت فضلها واستكترت أعمالها أفلحت من بعد هلك أن أعوان الهوى اعتنوا في أمرها أن خففوا أحمالها أهو روحي من هوى صدر كبير فائق كل مدح قالها فيه ازدرت أقوالها ييأس النفس اللقاء في وصال فائت حين تتلو في كتاب الغيب من أفعالها حبذا إحسان مولى عاد روحا إذ نفث ناولتها شربة صفى لها أحوالها إن روحي تقشع اللقيات في الماضي مدى ثم لا تبصر مضى إذ تفكر استقبالها اختفى العشق الثقيل في ضميري درة إن روحي قد أثقلت من درة قد شالها مثله إن أثقل اليوم المخاض حرة أوقعتها في ردى لم تغنها أحجالها غير أن سيدا جادت لها ألطافه إن روحي ربة واستنزلت أطلالها. سيدا مولا عزيزا كاملا في أمره شمس دين مالك أوفت لها آمالها صادف المولى بروحي وهي في ذل الردى من زمان أكرمته ما رأت إذلالها جاء من تبريز سربال نسيج بالهوى اكتست روحي صباحا أنزعت سربالها قالت الروح افتخارا اصطفانا فضله ثم غارت بعد حين من مقال نالها. This is the poem. Do you like it?
I love it.
Yep.
تسلم يا علي.
Yes, sure.
Good.
صح لسانك دكتورة.
تسلموا. That's our Arabic pleasantries. It goes with the poem too. So now I am going to go back and I am going to kind of have some stops in the poem. So here she goes. He says, so my soul saw a beautiful being, a beautiful, Malihan is a beautiful person. زلزلت زلزالها. And what he says, when my soul saw him, I was feeling an earthquake. An earthquake hit me. زلزلة زلزالها. You know how your soul is shaking as if it's in a very strong earthquake. إن عطش روحي فقلت ويح روحي ما لها. My soul became so thirsty that I wondered, what is going on with my soul? ذاق من شعشاع خمر العشق روحي جرعة طار في جو الهوى واستقلعت أثقالها. My soul tasted a wine, and wine is a constant wine, and the wine and the boys who are offering the wine, asaqi, all of those are symbolism. Remember, that's why I mentioned Rabi Al-Adawiyah, because that's the context she knows, and because wine has always been part of it's the wine of intoxication. You say, he's drunk in her love, and Arabic is so erotic and so poetic and can handle so much of this stuff and that's why you see how it's really hard to take this and put it in English. So, Tony tried to, through his love for Rumi, try to really distill it and put it in an English poem. So he says, so my soul was quenched by some of the wine of ishq. So in Arabic, we have 67 words that I know for love, right? So there is more. So, I cannot translate this to love because there is difference between ishq and love. There's difference between ishq and hub and hiyam and all kind of other things. And that's why, when you read the manual of love, you will see that there is stations of love, and there is conditions of love, and there is circumstances that produce love, and the different love is a different thing. So ishq is the word that is used for love. It's not hub in the Sufi context, because it's way beyond love. So ذاق من شعشاع خمر العشق روحي جرعة طار في جو الهوى واستقلعت أثقالها. So it dropped all the weights that it had on it, and it just became just a spiritual being and just flew in في جو الهوى. It flew in the earth. It flew in the horizon of love. So hawa is another word for love. صار روحي في هواه غارقا حتى درى لو تلقاه درير تائه أحوالها. My love became so, my soul became so drowned in that love that even if a blind person came by, they would know what's wrong with me. في الهوى من ليس في الكونين بدر مثله. إن روحي في الهوى من لا ترى أمثالها. As you see, all of the slides here have a dual line, like there is two lines together, because those are shatra and ajz. This is also a qasida, which is very rhythmic, has two parts for it. So the two parts are one line in Arabic. في الهوى من ليس في الكونين بدر مثله. إن روحي في الهوى من لا ترى أمثالها. When in love, my soul, في الكونين بدر مثله. إن روحي في الهوى من ليس في الكون. Yeah, in the two universes, in the two worlds, in this world and the worlds of God, that there is no Badr is a full moon. So again, the moon also have stages. So, and each one has its own implication. So in the two worlds, there is nobody that's like my lover, and you cannot find anybody that loves like me. لم تمل روحي إلى مال إلى أن أعشقت رامت الأموال كي تنثر له أموالها. This is another concept that exists in spiritual and Sufi poetry, which they become detached from material things. And he says, I was always detached from material things. I didn't want any wealth, but when I loved him, I wanted to reach out and search and get wealth because I wanted to throw it under his feet. Tanthur lahu is throw it, spread it for him. So because he loves him so much, he wants to get this wealth so he can show him that whatever, the more wealthy and the more jewels and the more praiseworthy what he has, if he throw it for him, then it becomes not worthy of the then becomes an indication of the stage of his love. I'll go faster because I'm gonna stop at 15 minutes for Dr. Mohsen, 15 minutes for the question and answers. How much you want me to give for question and answer?
10 minutes will be okay.
Okay, good. Yeah. So I have about 12 more minutes. I will try to wrap this up. I can talk about this forever, as you can tell. So, لم تزل سفن الهوى تجري بها مذ أصبحت في بحار العز والإقبال يوما يا لها. لم تزل. So I am now sailing in this ocean of love, and I am taken through this new context, and it is through pride, through في بحار العز والإقبال. العز والإقبال means that, okay, he is in this condition where he is lofty, he is glorious, but he also is attached. He is attached to his beloved. عين روحي قد أصابتها. عين روحي قد أصابتها فأردتها بها حين عدت فضلها واستكترت أعمالها. So the vision of my eye, my ability to see what's in my soul, killed me. So this is a very complicated sentence because literally he says عين روحي, the eye of my soul, قد أصابتها, hit it. So there's here like the jealous eye, the evil eye, but it's not here evil, but it's the glands did its doing and killed it. فأردتها بها means it killed it. حين عدت فضلها واستكثرت أعمالها, when it counted its virtues and its blessing. أفلحت من بعد هلك إن أعوان الهوى اعتنوا في أمرها أن خففوا أحمالها. And he says she's dying, the soul is dying when she recognizes the station of this love and what this love does to my soul. And so he calls on all of those people within the realm of love to come and help him and assist him in his journey, because he cannot handle it by himself. It's just too much for his soul to bear. It killed it. It obliterated it. أنخففوا أحمالها أمرها أنخففوا أحمالها, take away the burdens of the soul. أهو روحي من هوى صدر كبير فائق كل مدح قالها فيه ازدرت أقوالها. And he says, oh my soul, in the love of this huge being, everything that I say in his praise, the words themselves mock it. So the words themselves tell me when I say something in his praise that it's what I'm saying, it's not worthy. I cannot express that in the material being. ييأس النفس اللقاء من وصال فائت حين تتلو من كتاب الغيب من أفعالها. So he's talking about the desperation that the soul experiences because that wisal, that connection, that reunion had been severed. It was in the past. And when it thinks about the kind of relationship that they have, it just becomes even more desperate in its yearning for the beloved. حبذا إحسان مولا عاد روحا إذ نفت ناولتها شربة صفى لها أحوالها. All what I need is the kindness and the charity of my master by coming back and being with me. All what he have to do is give me a drink and all my affairs will be fine. صفى لها أحوالها ناولته شربة صفى لها أحوالها. إن روحي تقشع اللقيات من ماضي مدى ثم لا تبصر مضى إذ تفكر استقبالها. So my soul is in such a turmoil that all what it can think of is thinking about the past reunions and then see nothing else and think about the possibility of the coming reunion. So he lives for this love. He either thinking about it in the past or he is living for it to come in the future. So he says this heavy ishq that is in my conscious, it's like a pearl. But this pearl, my soul is heavy carrying that pearl. This pearl is this ishq that is so heavy like a rock. There is a whole concept of the rock and the symbolism of rock within Arabic also literature. But then he says, my soul is like this pearl, durratan, or a jewel, that is making my heart and my soul heavy. I cannot, من درة شالها. شالها يشيل الشيء is to carry him, lift it up, carry it. مثله إن أثقل اليوم المخاض حرة أوقعتها في ردى لم تغنها أحجالها. So he described this and he says this is like a free woman. So there is a hurra. Hurra means more than a free woman. It means like a respectable, from a very good lineage woman. So you have the hurra and al-abda, the slave woman and the free woman. And so it's like a woman who is one of those respectable free women who had the pain of birth. It doesn't matter how much jewelry she has when she's birthing, she's giving birth. These jewels are not gonna save her from the pain of delivery and from the pain of not being there, dying. غير إن روحي غير أن سيدا جادت لها ألطافه إن روحي ربة واستنزلت أطلالها. So all what will take away all of this madness and all of this confusion and all of this turmoil I'm in is my master, who with his kindness, with tenderness, will have mercy on my soul, and then he will استنزلت أطلالها, he will bring himself down to be there with me. And then he describes him, سيدا مولا عزيزا كاملا في أمره شمس دين مالك أوفت لها أمالها. So who is, then he described the lover, and he says he is my master, beloved, for perfect in everything, and then and he is the answer to all my hopes and aspiration. صادف المولى بروحي وهي في دل الردى من زمان أكرمته ما رأت أدلالها. So my soul met this master when it was down and very abased, did not understand the science of love, the art of love. And when I honored him, all of these abasements left. I became also a divine. جاء من تبريز سربال نسيج بالهوى اكتست روحي صباحا أنزعت سربالها. So here, this is where, you know, people can interpret whatever they want to interpret, and there's other places, because he says he came from Tabriz, which is referring to Shamsuddin Tabrizi, his master, and he was robed in love, in nasij, in like woven love, and my soul became covered with that love. And when he took away that love, اكتست روحي صباحا أنزعت سربالها, it left all what it had, all its garments. So Tabriz came, Shamsuddin Tabriz came, and he had this incredible garment of love, hawa, another lofty word of love, and my soul was wrapped in that what he brought, and left its own clothing. And it says, and then the soul says very proudly, he have selected me, that's part of his mercy. And then when he says that, because that is so insufficient, he regrets his words. So basically, no matter how he can describe love, he cannot describe it. No matter how much the words are high and lofty, they come short of describing his lover. So I hope this adds a little bit more into the exact literal translation of the poem itself. I want to just take 1 minute. I think I have 2 minutes. I'm going to take 2 minutes, and I want to share with you another poem that is less dramatic and less intense, but a reflection of I missed. Okay. So this is another poem, and this is if you read Arabic and English, you will see this is almost literally translated. It took us one try on this because there is not much in it. It's a very like direct verbal thing. And it says, and then I'm going to read it for you in Arabic. It said, بكت عيني غداة البين دمعا وأخرى بالبكا بخلت علينا فعاقبت التي بخلت علينا بأن غمضتها يوم التقينا. So basic, I didn't have to go in the soul or where did it go and what happened to it and it drowned and earthquakes and all of that to translate that to English. This was a direct translation. If you read the English and the Arabic, they are almost the same. So this is another example of easy versus complex. And most Arabic stuff is complex because they, you know, they've been doing this for many centuries and decades. Should we open for questions? I think exactly 10 minutes.
Yes. Now we open the floor for questions.
Any questions?
I have a request, not a question.
Yes.
إذا سمح لدينا الوقت أرجو أن لا تبخلي علينا وتقرأي لنا هذا الشعر فقط بشكل سريع لكي نستمتع به، إذا لا يوجد مانع طبعا في نهاية. إذا سمح لك الوقت.
Okay.
أرجو أن لا
Ali is asking that I read the poem one more time in Arabic so he can.
هذه العين. I was talking about هذه العين.
هذه العين. You want me to read this one?
It's a request. If you have enough time.
Take a second. يلا خلص. بكت عيني غداة البين دمعا وأخرى بالبكا بخلت علينا فعاقبت التي بخلت علينا بأن غمضتها يوم التقينا.
Beautiful indeed.
Okay. Any
questions? I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any knowledge if Rumi has written any poems of different type other than love and spirituality?
Well, I mean, his Persian poem, yeah, a lot of his Persian poems have a lot of wisdom. They have a lot of hikam wa amthal, you know. So there is a lot of other things that he wrote about, and he wrote other things other than the poetry. But Diwan Shams Tabrizi, as I said, it wasn't even edited, and you could see that it's not edited. But it's incredible. I mean, for people who understand Arabic in this group, if anybody comes and tell you that Rumi's poetry in Arabic were, you know, less well developed than his Persian poetry, please share with him some of his poems. Because if you cannot read it right, then you break the meter. And if you break the meter, it sounds like Rumi didn't know how to put the meter. But the meter is there. You just have to really, I mean, I have, you know, the poems that I translated, I have a lot of, I'm a member of the Jordanian Writers Association, and I have a lot of friends who write qasida amudiyya, you know, this form of strict metered poetry. And I have sent those poems to them. And actually, one thing that I have said that it is written, his qasida is written in the form of rubaiyat, which is very interesting because it's written like a rubaiyat because that's the form that he's familiar with writing the Persian work. And I don't know how he did that. I think that's just an amazing mystery that how could he embed them in there? So I'm wondering, I'm trying to really think about it and kind of theorize about how he did it. I wonder if he just wrote them and but he didn't because he was saying them. So he, you know, I mean, it's whatever his cognitive memory of Arabic that produced those poems in that point.
We have a question from Michael Acosta. He's asking, what started your interest in Rumi?
What started my interest in Rumi? I have been reading some Sufi work, and I've read some Sufi work that I am very, you know, I'm very attached to, and it mentioned it had some of Rumi's poetry quoted in there, and I decided to go and look into Rumi's poetry. You know, Rumi is very famous in the West, but he is not well recognized in most of Arab countries because, you know, Sufism is not exactly celebrated in many Arab countries. Now there is a resurgence of interest in him, but he is more famous in the West than he is famous in the East. The problem is in the West, he had been almost taken out of his Islamic context, which is, you know, when you read the Arabic poems, you cannot take him out of that. They are very obviously, you know, with the context, with his references to surahs and ayahs, and you always find them in there. So you could see how these two are really meshed together.
Mm-hmm. I believe this is all the time we have. Please join me again in thanking Dr. Akhtarkhavari